Okay, I think we have everything now. Once again, good morning, everyone, and welcome back. The course in bioethics at the beginning of human life at St. Thomas University. Turns out that the science building AC is broken, and it's one of these newfangled buildings that has no windows. Well, it has windows, but you can't open them, cannot open. So it's like a sweatbox in there in the middle of summer in Miami. And therefore we have to come to another building here in a hallway because it turns out, coincidentally, this weekend is the holiday, the Juneteenth holiday. So really most of the university is closed except for this Donor Hall building next to us. And providentially, it has air conditioning, just this one hallway. And that's why Antonio and I are in the hallway. He's in his laptop and so am I. And so are you. So we're gonna go forward. Any questions or comments before continuing? I hope people are able to connect and hear me and see the screen, just as we do in the other classroom. Beginning always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O Lord, send forth your Spirit, and we shall be recreated. You shall renew the face of the earth. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Okay, going forward then. This is our last lecture on topics in bioethics at the beginning of human life. And so I always like to end in a positive note, but before there, we have to get through several topics. So again, if there's any question or comments from the previous lectures, you may speak now or hold your peace. All right, so this lecture, first of all, there's no summary for this lecture. Always the last lecture in this section, there's no summary because it's more speculative, if you will. It's kind of the latest, what's happening in bioethics at the beginning of human life in this case. Later we'll look at the end of human life, all right? And so always for the last lecture on a section or a module, there's no summary. So that's something positive. Okay, and today we're going to look at further manipulations on human embryos, because keep in mind that what is driving a lot of technology today, what is driving a lot of bioethics, bioethical issues is the technology. Simply the fact that what used to be science fiction in the past now can be done in the lab. And so as I said at the beginning of the course, it's not a question of can we do it, but may we do it, right? In other words, the distinction between can and may is not just a grammatical distinction, it's an existential distinction, and it can mean the difference between life and death for a number of people, depending on where they are on the side of life or death, okay? So technology drives a lot of the bioethical issues today precisely because things can be done in the lab or in the field or in society today, but the question is, should they be done? May they be done, all right? And that's what we're analyzing. So we're gonna look at some issues, these latest issues, if you will, that are heavily technological. And specifically, three topics: prenatal diagnosis, human-animal chimeras, and fetal medicine and surgery. So let's go forward then. First, prenatal diagnosis. Okay. Actually, prenatal diagnosis has been around for quite a while in the traditional sense or the classic sense. But now it has moved forward with a lot of techniques that can be used that some become more and more invasive, but others are not as invasive, and that will make a difference with regards to the bioethical analysis. So as always, first we're going to look at the biological or the clinical or the technological aspect of things, what is actually happening, and then we'll do our bioethical evaluation based on that bioethical analysis. Prenatal diagnosis is also known as PND or just simply PD, right? These are the acronyms that are used in clinical settings. And let's look at some of the techniques that are used. Globally, we can classify the techniques into non-invasive or minimally invasive or more invasive. Okay, and this is important, this is informative with regards to the bioethical analysis. Again, because we're trying to assess risk of the mother and her child within her womb. So how invasive the technique is significant and informative for the bioethical analysis, especially if some of these techniques actually have a risk of procuring an abortion or triggering an abortion or miscarriage, all right? But you keep in mind that this abortion or miscarriage is not spontaneous, it's not natural because the technology is not natural. Any technology that is inserted into the woman's womb obviously is not something natural, right? And therefore, these abortions or procured abortions or miscarriages are caused by the technology itself, and that is a risk to evaluate. So for the non-invasive or minimally invasive, basically these are four main categories. We have external exam, ultrasound or sonogram, cervical mucus swabbing, and maternal blood overall. So let's go through them. First, external exam is simply the examination that the OBGYN does on his or her patient who is pregnant. So a pregnant mom typically will have medical care, and that care generally is provided by a specialist, OBGYN, right? Who can be a man or a woman, of course, even though traditionally most OBGYNs have been men. Anyway, the simplest exam that is done on a regular basis when the pregnant mom goes to the doctor to be checked for her pregnancy, right, is palpation. In other words, literally touching the abdomen of the mother and seeing how the pregnancy is progressing, because OBGYNs are trained to detect, let's say, movement and things like that, all right? And the firmness, for example, of the abdomen, etc., of the swollen abdomen as she swells throughout the 9 months. Obviously, it's quite a bit of swelling that goes on, and keep in mind that as she swells, as the fetus is growing within, all the other internal organs are compressed, right? Including the stomach, the bladder, etc. So she will, it's kind of paradoxical in a sense, because her stomach is being compressed, so she has less room for food generally as the pregnancy progresses, but she gets progressively more hungry, right? And the typical pregnancy cravings of eating, black beans and peanut butter and ice cream all together, because her body is craving for all kinds of food to nourish two bodies, her own and her unborn. And so it's a bit of a paradox that as her stomach shrinks, she's actually more hungry because she has to feed two people, all right? So all that is detected. At the same time, the bladder is also squeezed, and so she retains less urine, so she has to urinate more often, meaning that a bathroom needs to be nearby all the time, and so on and so forth. So, a pregnancy has a definite impact on the anatomy and physiology of the woman, in addition to her psychology, obviously. So the blood pressure also of the mother, this is very important. This is part of the vital signs, right? Because keep in mind, there is something called pre-eclampsia, and pre-eclampsia is just high blood pressure during pregnancy, which is risky because it can affect, obviously, the health or the life of the mother. It can affect the health or the life of the unborn child. And it's simply because of the extra demands on her circulatory system that the placenta is putting on her body, right? Again, there are two circulations going on. And the fetal circulation is handled fine by the fetal heart and the fetal heartbeat. Again, I'm talking on average, right? On the norm. Most embryos and fetuses are able to handle their own circulation through their own circulatory system, meaning their heartbeat, which is very fast, by the way. I remember I mentioned that before, 150 to 200 beats per minute, whereas an average heartbeat may be 70 or 80 beats per minute for any normal adult, all right? But again, the body is very tiny, but that does exert pressure on the placenta through the placenta into the mother's circulatory system because they're intertwined at the capillary level. There's more to say there. I'll hold off for now because we're just getting started, but there's a lot of interaction actually that happens at the anatomical and physiological level between the two sides of the placenta, right? The fetal side and the mother's side. So the blood pressure needs to be monitored on a regular basis. Pre-eclampsia is a sign of high blood pressure, and we don't want that to turn into full-blown eclampsia, because full-blown eclampsia then is extremely dangerous for the mother and for the child. She can essentially have a stroke or a heart attack with a full-blown eclampsia, okay? And she could also go into renal failure and multiple organ shutdown. Her weight is also monitored because now she weighs more, obviously. You know, it's a temporary gain of weight, but quite significant. Remember, the embryo grows from about 10 microns to about a foot, more or less, at birth. In 9 months, about 5,000 times his or her original size as a fertilized egg, as a zygote, all right? And so that weight is significant. In fact, I want to mention while I'm at it that, you know, that all the major organs and systems are formed within the first 2 months, in the first 8 weeks of pregnancy, right? But in miniature, because the embryo has only about 1 inch in length, so all the organs and systems are there in miniature, the major organs, certainly the vital organs. And what happens going forward for the next 7 months of the pregnancy, right, is mostly growth in size, and further development and specialization, okay, cellular and tissue and organ specialization, but it's mostly growth in size. In other words, augmenting the number of cells by the millions and billions in each one of these vital organs. And so you can see the physical growth there for the last 7 months of pregnancy. And also technically, the unborn changes name from embryo to fetus. It's again, another technicality of embryology. All right, so there are many signs and symptoms of the mother that can be detected just by an external exam, including the dialogue that goes on between the doctor and the patient and the mom, you know, asking her how she's feeling, if the baby is moving within, etc., if she's bleeding or anything like that, okay? So that's all part of the examination of the visit. Obviously, that is non-invasive as such because the doctor has not introduced any instruments into her body, all right, except perhaps a thermometer or something like that for measuring the temperature. Okay, So ultrasound and sonogram here, you see, we're starting to go into the technology, right? The ultrasound was invented a few decades ago. I don't know exactly when, but fairly recently in the history of medicine, for sure. And sonogram, which is the same instrument, but the same instrument is able to detect both visual and audio, okay? So obviously sonogram is a reference to the sound that the ultrasound picks up, but the ultrasound itself is these waves that go through the abdominal region, in this case, the abdominal region of the pregnant mother, to visualize the unborn. And you've seen these visualizations. Now they're in 3D. They can be made in 3D, and even, I guess, 4D is video, the embryo, the fetus actually moving within the mother's womb. You can see those online, but basically, this is a technique that does not cause harm to the mother, so it's considered non or minimally invasive, just the sound waves going through the abdominal region. I mean, we have sound waves going through our body right now, all kinds, galore, all right? For example, just consider that the internet, we don't see the waves of the internet, and yet the internet is live right now because we're able to communicate with each other remotely through the internet, through the web. And so those are waves that are going through the building and through our bodies right now. And that's just one kind of wave. If we had a radio, for example, and we turn on the radio, we hear music, right? Or we hear chat, whatever. And yet, without the radio or with the radio off, we don't hear that music and that chat, even though those waves, those sound waves are going through the air right now as wherever we are. Otherwise, we wouldn't pick it up. It's not that the waves begin when we turn on the radio, right? They're going on right now. And even more than that, think of classified information. For example, if we had one of these decoder, or we had some kind of classified instrument that is able to detect, well, let's say a bank, for example, a bank and banking account information, right, that is being transmitted right now from station to station and is going through the air. If we had the equipment to detect that encoded, I was looking for the word, that encoded information, we will be able to see whatever it is, numbers, account numbers, etc. All right. So that takes it to another level. And even a further level, just to finalize the thing, talk about military information, defense information, that again is going through the atmosphere of the Earth, and we just don't have the equipment to detect it, right? But some people do, the military does. And so they also have transmitters and responders of these waves that are going through the atmosphere with their specialized technology. Okay, so basically, bottom line, what I'm trying to say is that waves go through our body to a certain degree, you know, in certain pitches or frequencies that don't really damage the body, all right, do no harm. And therefore, this is considered a non-invasive or minimally invasive technique. I'm just spending too much time on this stuff at the beginning. So let's move on. Cervical mucus swabbing or suctioning, this can also be a suctioning, is this. Basically, there are fetal cells. Okay, so let's think about the fetus for a moment. And the fetus has this one external organ that is a vital organ, but it's temporary. Okay, so let's do some imaging here. And perhaps I can move this down here. All right, so let's think of some pictures here. Well, I want one with a placenta. Okay, well, we'll use a diagram. Here's one that's convenient because it has everybody involved, the mother and the child. So the fetus is here, obviously, in that it happens to be in a breech position. This is called breech position, B-R-E-E-C-H, which is not the ideal position for birthing, of course. We want the head first, all right? Anyway, here's the umbilical cord, and here's the placenta. And the placenta has two parts to it functionally, there and also anatomically. The internal part is derived, remember, from the trophoblast of the blastocyst, right? Whereas the internal part of the placenta or mother's side is actually the thickened endometrium. And here's another one given a diagram of the connection, highly vascularized, all right? Very, very vascularized. Here's an example. Oh, good, this is a good diagram. So this is the fetal side, and this is the mother's side. So below is the fetal side, and above is the mother's side. And this is the interface right here, precisely. You can see that these capillaries, right, these blood vessels are made by the trophoblast, which is the outer layer of the blastocyst, remember, at implantation, okay? So these are fetal cells, whereas on the mother's side, this is all endometrium, right? And here is some blood vessel that the trophoblast has invaded, okay? So see the maternal blood here. This is some blood vessel of the mother. And it's supplying precisely, is providing essentially is providing access to the maternal circulatory system, all right? So before moving on, let's just think about this functionally for a moment. See, here's a fetal blood cell, a blood vessel, capillary, and it's going to carry, what is that fetal blood going to carry? It's going to carry essentially the waste of the fetus, that is metabolic waste that is not going to the bladder, all right? It's not urine, it's not urea, is not protein breakdown that is filtered by the kidneys. This is mostly the waste that is in the blood that needs to be exhaled. So that's the key, exhaled, meaning this is metabolic waste of cellular respiration. Bottom line, CO2, all right? So that CO2 needs to leave the body of the fetus, but obviously the lungs are non-functional yet. It's the one vital organ that is really non-functional during pregnancy, and the first breath of the child is taken at birth. And the lungs need to start working at that point. It's an issue with the surfactant, which is a layer of fluid that coats the alveoli for good oxygenation, all right? So anyway, that's at birth. But before birth, the lungs are obviously non-functional. Now, but the fetus is metabolizing, which means that the fetus is using oxygen and releasing CO2, all right? Where are those gases coming from? Those gases are coming from the mother, specifically from the blood of the mother. So the fetus is functionally using the lungs of the mother to obtain his or her own oxygen and to get rid of, to release his or her own CO2. All right. So again, most vital organs of a pregnant mom are doing double duty during the pregnancy, including the lungs. So the lungs of the mother are breathing for her and for her child. And that means that the maternal blood will supply oxygen to the fetal blood through the placenta, through the capillaries in the placenta, and vice versa. The maternal blood will pick up CO2 from the fetal blood, again, in the capillaries within the placenta, okay? All right. Now, in addition to that, there you see these cells that are essentially dispersing within the endometrium and will pass through the uterine wall and also into the mother's circulatory system. So at some point, the mother will have within her own circulatory system fetal cells from the placenta or even from other parts of the body internally, because we're shedding cells all the time. Not only is our skin shedding cells, so the amniotic fluid is full of cells of the fetus, right? Mostly epidermal cells, but also internally, okay? But significantly, these particular cells that come from the trophoblast, meaning the fetus, actually pass through the endometrium and end up inside the uterus, all right? And some of them will actually migrate down through the cervix toward the vagina, especially around the cervix, because there is a little bit of fluid leakage there. Even though there's a plug, there's what is called a cervical plug during pregnancy, all right, just to keep things tight and shut in there. But at the microscopic level, one can expect to have a little bit of leakage here, right? See, this is the proper position for birthing, definitely. And what happens then is that the bottom line is that there will be a little bit of fluid here, cervical mucus, right? During pregnancy, that at some point will have some of these fetal cells. So isn't that a great discovery? And with a little swab of the cervix, some of these cells may be collected. Now, we don't need a lot of cells, even just one single cell. The DNA of a single cell now can be amplified by PCR in the lab, polymerase chain reaction, and amplify. It's called amplifying the DNA of that fetus, and then can be sent for analysis, all right? So that is the whole thing about the cervical mucus swabbing. It is amazing and very sweet because it's minimally invasive, right? When we consider the body of the mother herself is simply a swab of her cervix to pick up some of that mucus. Sweet. All right. Then I also mentioned the maternal blood itself because some of these fetal cells go into the maternal blood. And so the mother will also have fetal cells floating around in her circulatory system at some point, all right? And again, it's a give and take with the immune system because those fetal cells are recognized partially as self, meaning that 50% of the DNA in the fetal cells is maternal DNA, right? But the other 50% is paternal. So the immune system doesn't know exactly what to do with those cells. I guess some of them get digested, but others are able to escape the immune system. But the point is that there are fetal cells in the maternal blood as the pregnancy progresses. And now, even more than that, what has been discovered is free-floating DNA, free-floating fetal DNA in the maternal blood also, all right? That's interesting because that raises it to another level, meaning that some of this, it's kind of speculative right now, but it is thought that some of that free-floating fetal DNA is able to integrate into some of the organs of the mother, and therefore actually enhance her immune system. Or perhaps may cause problems in the next pregnancy. This is all an emerging field right now, studying the free-floating fetal DNA that is found in maternal blood. But you can see the possibilities is quite exciting. And that's why I have it here as FFF-DNA. This is just my own acronym. I have not found an actual acronym for it, but I invented my own. And so it's free-floating fetal DNA in maternal blood, okay? FFF-DNA or 3F DNA. You can make up your own. The point is that this free-floating DNA can also be detected, collected by what? By a blood sample of the mother, which again can be a pretty routine checkup, right? A blood sample. It's minimally invasive, yes, because a syringe is involved. Also, so more traditionally, other factors have been observed, or other factors have been monitored in the blood of pregnant mothers. For example, alpha-fetoprotein, which could be an indication if it's a high presence or a certain level of alpha-fetoprotein in the maternal blood that could indicate a further analysis, okay, to bump it up a notch, as it were, to another level of analysis, because this fetal protein, as the word says, alpha-fetoprotein, is associated with some kind of neurological complication or neurological birth effect. It could be hydrocephaly, or it could be microcephaly or anencephaly with regards to the brain, or in the spinal cord. It could be a meningocele or some other anomaly of the nervous system, which today can be treated in uterus, some of them, all right? So just cutting all the way down to the very last topic of today, which is fetal medicine and surgery. In other words, the fetus as a medical patient. Okay, so we'll get there. Anyway, you can see the levels here from non to minimally invasive, but very standard. It certainly doesn't risk the health or the life of the mother significantly, nor of her unborn child, any of these techniques, okay? But they are informative, very informative on how that pregnancy is progressing. Again, the health of the mother and the health of her unborn child. All right, let's move on to the other category of invasive. Sorry, did I hear a question or a comment?
Yes, it's me, Cristina.
Yes.
What can be found with the cervical, with the fetal trophoblast cervical mucus swabbing?
Oh, yes, excellent. Right, okay. So I was going to get to it at the end because it's tied in with this, actually what to do with the result. But essentially, if they're looking at DNA, then if they're looking at fetal DNA, the obvious thing is going to be, is it normal or is it abnormal? All right. For example, they would do first a karyotype, which you're familiar now with karyotype, right? Just to see if the fetus has full number of chromosome pairs as for the human, right? Per map like this, and to see, and by the way, as added value. They're going to be able to know the sex of the fetus with precision, not just the ultrasound by looking at the external anatomy, but actually with at the chromosomal level with the XX or XY pair. All right, so that's the first thing that will be done. This is just the more basic thing. If there is perhaps some indication that there's some anomaly here, then that would be an indication for further manipulation of the DNA and look at actual genes, critical genes, to see if there are any anomalies there. And I can tell you without going into much detail that today in the lab, there is an increasing number of genetic defects that can be found by the DNA sequence, all right? It's in the dozens, going into the hundreds. We have 10 to 20,000 genes approximately, so let's take the average of that, about 15,000 genes that make up the human body, 15,000. So there can be any number of anomalies in any one of those genes, right? So we're talking about dozens of thousands of genes of anomalies in the DNA that may or may not have an impact on the human body. Some may be as small as maybe missing, let's say, I'm going to be kind of drastic, missing the fingernail of one pinky. That's certainly compatible with life, right? That is kind of superficial. Maybe it's at the aesthetic level, just missing the fingernail of one pinky, for example, on the lesser thing, all right? On the more drastic thing, it could be the genes that code for the development of, well, I have to think of something that is not used during the embryonic stage, during the pregnancy. Well, let's say the functioning of the lungs. Surfactant, for example, the gene that codes for making surfactant, which is a fluid that covers the alveoli, right, and allows for the air exchange for the lungs to function, basically. So if a gene that codes for surfactant is defective, it won't be known until birth, and the child on that first breath will gasp for air and essentially die of asphyxia because cannot do the exchange that is needed with that first breath, all right? So that's certainly a vital function, right? So that kind of, that's where genetic is going today with regards to maternal fetal medicine and surgery, okay? But it's just nascent, it's just emerging, just in its very primitive stage. The potential is amazing for healing in the womb. You can see for healing in the womb, the potential is amazing, all right? And there are other issues, the other perspectives for considering from a number of reasons. The human fetus in the womb is the ideal patient for a number of reasons. You'll see why. We'll get there. Anyway, maybe I went too far afield, but you can see that by getting fetal DNA, a whole range of exams can be done on that DNA, right? Okay, moving into invasive. It's kind of more of the same, but with more invasive techniques. And again, these, at least the first three, are more traditional now. They've been around since the 90s, more or less. Well, fetoscopy has been around longer. Actually, it's inserting an instrument let's see, use the web. The picture says 1,000 words. So, well, this is actually a stethoscope, but there's another one that can be inserted. to monitor internally, right? It can be monitoring mostly sound from the fetus, the fetoscope. And while I was at it here, I saw a diagram that had also, here's the ultrasound, for example. Everyone's familiar with that, right? Anyway, sorry, I'm getting distracted. I want to concentrate on these two, amniocentesis and chorionic villi sampling, all right? So amnio is essentially taking up some fluid, extracting from amniotic fluid. So I'm just trying to use the internet for imaging here. Obviously guided by ultrasound, right? A relatively large bore needle is inserted all the way through the abdominal cavity into the amnion, which is the membrane that is holding the amniotic fluid, and the fetus is within, right? The idea is to extract some of that fluid, which will contain fetal cells. And then it's mostly epidermal cells, but there can be some other cells there. Placental cells, for example, on the fetal side, okay? And then that's sent to the lab for analysis. Essentially, same or similar to those cells that are obtained now through the cervical mucus. Here's the plug, as you can see, all right? So that's amnio. Obviously, this is a more invasive technique. It's actually puncturing through, and it carries a risk of about up to maybe 0.1 or 0.5%. I would say on average around 0.1% of inducing an abortion or a miscarriage. Miscarriage at this point because already it's the fetus, right? So, 0.1% is not insignificant. It means that 1 out of 1,000, right? Even if we have that to 0.05%, okay? 0.05% is 1 in 5,000. 1 in 5,000 women that go through amniocentesis may, amniocentesis may actually trigger a miscarriage, an abortion. So it's not insignificant, okay? And therefore, it has to have a reason for doing this. It's not standard. The checkup is certainly invasive and therefore is not part of the standard protocol, all right? There has to be a reason for it. While I'm in this photo on this diagram, see the bladder here, all right? Greatly compressed. All right. So amniocentesis carries, even if it's just a even 0.05, as you will see in the literature, is not insignificant, all right?
So
Chorionic villus sampling can carry a higher degree. Let me just finish this, because now that is actually sampling some cells from the fetal side of the placenta, from the chorionic villi. So, chorionic villus sampling, there it is. So there are several membranes. The amnion and the chorion are membranes that envelope the fetus. And the amnion is inside. And the chorion is another membrane that flares out, precisely enveloping the capillaries, the fetal capillaries in the placenta, all right? And so these hair-like structures, which actually hold the capillaries of the fetus, of the fetal placenta, they're called villi. One villus, several villi, is just Latin for hair. A villus is a hair in Latin, okay? The idea is to insert a scapula with a cannula. Scapula opens the vagina for the cannula to come through and pluck or aspirate, if you will, some of those villi, chorionic villi. Again, the idea is to get at cells from the fetus for analysis in the lab. Of course, as you can see, with the advent of especially the swabbing, right? And the detection of the FFF DNA in the mother's blood, then these techniques are kind of falling by the wayside because they also carry, so chorionic villi can carry 1 to 2% triggering a miscarriage. All right, it's more invasive. You can see that more is being done to the anatomy of the mother. First of all, by expanding the vagina, that is compromising the plug. Also inserting the cannula, further compromise. All right. And so it's not without risk. When 1% is 1 in 100, 2% is 1 in 50. So 1 in 50 pregnant moms who have a CVS done may trigger a miscarriage, a loss of the pregnancy, okay? And obviously the death of the embryo, of the fetus. Okay, let me stop here for a moment then, and questions or comments?
So I have a question. When I was pregnant with Catalina, they recommended amniocentesis, but we decided not to do it.
Yes.
But I'm asking, and of course she's 33 years old. So probably the other two, you know, the cervical mucus swabbing might not be present at the moment. But my question is, if you have, and you kind of answered that, but why did the doctor recommend to do amniocentesis or the other test if you have these other two that are less invasive? I can speculate. Maybe it's money involved, because I remember when I was pregnant, it will cost $1,500 just to do the amniocentesis.
Right.
And so it was expensive.
Right. Okay. So, you know, doing procedures without a clinical justification is unethical, and it can cost the doctor the license. So I don't want to speculate as to they were doing it for money, all right, because that's certainly unethical, big time. But there are other reasons for it, clinical and or legal, actually. So we're going to kind of bracket that for a moment when we get into the bioethical analysis of P&D. In other words, we're still here in the methods, but we still need to arrive at the bioethical analysis, okay? But you'll see the reason that will come forward. Just for the sake of completion, just the percutaneous umbilical cord sampling, PUBS. Again, it's another variation of the theme. It is trying to obtain fetal cells one way or another for lab analysis, right? So let's look at that one for a moment. Percutaneous, there it is. Okay, so in this case, it looks similar to amnio, but instead of obtaining amniotic fluid, they're actually obtaining fetal blood from the base of the umbilical cord and the interface between the umbilical cord and the placenta. It seems to be the site of choice all right, here at the base of the placenta and the interface between the placenta and the umbilical cord. Well, one obvious reason that I can think of is that the umbilical cord itself is moving around. It's a dynamic state, right? And the fetus is actually grabbing it and intertwining with the umbilical cord, kind of playing with it. Therefore, it's not an easy target for the needle, right? But the base of the placenta here is definitely fixed, and it should not be moving around inside the mother's womb. So obviously, everything is guided by ultrasound to obtain fetal blood in this case, which is, you can think it's more informative than fetal free-floating cells in the amniotic fluid, right? That's the actual blood of the fetus, sorry. All right, so that's percutaneous umbilical cord sampling, or PUBS for short. Any questions, comments on the different techniques that are available today? Again, you can see that this is an expanding field, but it's getting pretty sophisticated now. And the whole move is toward minimally or non-invasive techniques to get as the same information essentially as is more traditional techniques, and without the risk of inducing an abortion, a procured abortion, or a miscarriage, all right? Okay, so as to the bioethical analysis, well, first of all, what's the overall purpose of PD? Well, to ascertain the health of the mother and to ascertain also the health of the child before birth, right? Because once the child is born, then the child passes from the OBGYN to the pediatrician, right? So the guiding post here is actually a document that I have asked you to read in the past, but perhaps I have not made too much emphasis on it. It's a little brochure, actually. In fact, I have one here in my suitcase. I think I usually carry a copy with me. Yeah, there it is. Kind of raggedy, but it's a good reference. This one here, I don't know if you can see it. I'll pull up a copy of it on the internet now. But Antonio, anyway, here's public exhibit number 1. Let's look at the ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare services. It's a big mouthful. We go by the first three words, ethical and religious directives, or ERD for short. ERDs for short. Keep a hold on it for a moment. Yeah, just keep a hold on it and you can examine it. So let's see, ERDs.
I printed from the last class.
Yes. Still trying to get probably this one. There we go. Okay, so you can just punch in ethical and religious directives, or you can put ERDs Catholic, as I have here. I hope you can see it. And it will take you to the website. Excuse me. Or you can just click into the link that I posted in Canvas on the in the syllabus. All right. So let's talk about this for a moment. I hope you can see it on the screen. Can someone verify that you can see it on the screen? Yes. Okay.
Yes, Father, yes.
Thank you.
But you also included as one of the handouts, I believe two classes ago for us to read it.
Right. Yes, exactly. So this is a document. Okay. And it's actually kind of a brochure that folds in half and one can put in the pocket. It fits very nicely inside a coat pocket, precisely for doctors and also other healthcare workers to have with them. as they do the rounds, whatever, as they talk to family of patients, as they talk to the patients themselves, because as the title says, the title is very informative. These are the directives that we use in bioethics for Catholic healthcare, right? So let's just browse through this document for a moment. It's put out by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. The latest edition is this one, the 6th edition, which was updated 2009 and then put digitally in 2018. And it's also translated into Spanish fully. All right, so that's also a good resource. It consists of 6 parts. And each part is like a mini chapter. You can think of each part as a mini chapter. And they're only about 2-3 pages each part. As you can see, for example, part 1 goes page 8 and 9. Then part 2 is page 10, 11, and 12. So 2 or 3 pages for each part. Very succinct, very compressed, but very, very informative. So the 6 parts, we can just go through the title here briefly. The social responsibility of Catholic healthcare. In other words, this is the whole issue of why the Catholic Church practices healthcare in society, right? For healing, essentially the healing ministry of Jesus, which is body and soul as an integral unit. And then the pastoral responsibility, this one concentrates mostly on the sacraments, the availability of the sacraments and other spiritual aids to patients and their family and friends. For example, the anointing of the sick, but even the Eucharist, confession, and any of the sacraments that should be available for patients and also for their family and friends, because we look at the holistic view of the human person. And I can tell you there's even some documentation that patients who have a spiritual life, a mature spiritual life, and are able to spiritualize their illness, their physical illness, they tend to heal faster and better, all right? And some studies have been done there, and that's why any number of healthcare systems, the large institutional healthcare systems, hospital systems, typically they have a pastoral center, pastoral care center that is integral to the mission of that system. Of course, for Catholics, no question about it, the Catholic hospitals always have a pastoral care that is very active with full-time priests and even nuns, religious orders that are nurses or doctors, and laity. Many of them are volunteers who are involved, and they make a connection in between the parish and the hospital, because many of these lay volunteers, they bring the Eucharist, for example, to patients, and they also bring prayers with them and so forth, okay? So the spiritual comfort of the patient does a lot toward their physical healing. Anyway, part 3, you can see, starts getting into the nitty-gritty of it, the doctor-patient relationship, essentially the doctor-patient relationship, which is very important, very delicate. In principle, it's confidential, but also there has to be tremendous trust, mutual trust and respect on both parts for that relationship to work, right? Then 2 aspects of healthcare from the bioethical perspective, the beginning of human life and the end of human life. So part 4 is beginning of human life, and this is the part that I ask you to read on your own. So I'm highlighting it today more specifically. And going forward from next lecture forward, the end of human life, again, part 5, which as you can see is essentially 3 pages, 20, 21, and 22, all right? And then finally, part 6, which is on collaboration. This is kind of the latest update of this directive, collaboration between Catholic hospitals and non-Catholic hospitals. So again, these directives in principle are at the institutional level. You can see here, Catholic Healthcare Services. So this is at the institutional level. However, many of these directives also apply, are relevant to the individual doctors, nurses, volunteers, priests, nuns, whoever is involved in healthcare, in Catholic healthcare today, all right? And by the way, Catholic healthcare in the United States is about, globally about 20% of the healthcare that is provided in the United States at the level of the 50 states overall. So it's about 1/5 of the healthcare that is provided in the United States is Catholic healthcare, all right? Obviously, people don't have to be Catholic to get healthcare in Catholic hospitals and other homes, nursing homes, clinics, etc. And depending on the region, that percentage could be even higher. All right, so collaboration, because today what we have is these systems, what are called systems. For you, those of you who are familiar with Dade County, Miami-Dade County, I've been living in this county for 52 years, more than half a century, okay? And I've seen a lot of growth in the county. And I can tell you that Baptist Hospital, for example, used to be what we call a standalone down there in the south of Kendall Drive and 87th Avenue, the corner of Kendall and 87th Avenue. For those of you who are familiar with Miami-Dade, that is a big intersection there. And Baptist used to be a standalone hospital there for decades with the big pineapple, which is a sign of the resurrection, by the way. And that system was created back, I think it was in the 50s, by Baptist doctors and pastors together. Talk about integration. And that's why it's called, to this day, Baptist Hospital, all right? And so spiritual healing and spiritual support of their patients and their family and friends is integral to the mission of Baptist Hospital System to this day. And I can attest to that, to the point that they even have priests and rabbis and sometimes even imams and certainly ministers, Protestant ministers on staff, salaried by their system, by the Baptist Hospital System. Okay. All right. So anyway, Baptist used to be a standalone back about 3 decades ago, up until the 90s. And then these mergers started happening. But the problem with the mergers is that sometimes there were friendly mergers, but sometimes there were aggressive mergers. In other words, it was a dog-eat-dog scenario as systems began to grow, right? Their acquisition power became larger and they would actually take over some other hospitals in the area to create a mega system and essentially try to create a monopoly. Well, an actual strict monopoly is illegal, all right? Those are laws that are established so that we don't end up with just one huge hospital system for the whole United States or even at the state level, because then they have no competition, right? And the market economy is not going to work without competition. So these hospital systems do have regulation on them big time, all right, at all levels. But anyway, back to the whole issue of Baptist. I'm using Baptist as an example because we also had a Catholic hospital in Miami that is called Mercy Hospital, right? And they're not that far away from each other. Mercy is in the area of Coconut Grove, for those of you if you're familiar with the city, whereas Baptist is down there in Kendall region, more or less the Dadeland, behind Dadeland shopping, Dadeland Mall. Anyway, there was talk at that time, back in the 90s, of a merger between Baptist Hospital and Mercy Hospital. And there was the talk was advancing quite a bit because they have very similar mission of integrating the physical health with the spiritual health of their patients. Okay, so the mission was very, very similar of these two hospitals, standalone at that time. But of course, Mercy Hospital, like any Catholic hospital in the United States, is obligated to abide by this document of the ethical and religious directives, right? And so, even though back then it was on the 5th edition, because it was before 2009, okay? But still, in one of those, precisely in part 4, in issues at the beginning of human life, there are some directives that talk about here, part 4, issues at the beginning of human life. It's only a couple of pages, basically. By the way, each part is subdivided into 2 parts, into 2 sections. One section is an introduction, which is basically 3 or 4 paragraphs. And then the other section is the actual directives, which are numbered consecutively from the very first directive in part 1 to the last directive in part 6. Okay, I forget now exactly what number. It's about 80 or 90 directives. Let me see the number here. 77. 77 is the last directive. So each directive is a paragraph embedded within its own section. Let me go back to part 4, since I have the document here. And you see that this directive involves issues at the beginning of human life, and it starts, at some point, starts talking about IVF. And the bottom line, artificial fertilization here, in vitro fertilization, basically, it separates, see? Prohibited when it separates the procreation from the marital act and the unitive significance. We've talked about this. Just magnify this a little bit. So this particular directive that I have highlighted was a stumbling block for that merger, because at that time and to this day, Baptist Hospital has a very profitable IVF clinic, all right? Has a very profitable IVF clinic. And they were not willing to give it up. And therefore, the merger fell through, okay? It would have been otherwise a very good thing, because then what happened was Baptist continued to grow. Well, Mercy was essentially bought by a big system, HCS of the United States, which has about 150 or 170 hospitals throughout the US. It's a huge conglomerate system, all right? And to this day, Mercy belongs to that system now. But providentially, in the covenant agreement, it was stated that Mercy would maintain its Catholic identity for 5 years into the contract. And they did oblige by that, all right? So meaning Catholic identity with these issues means, for example, there will be no procured abortions, they would not prescribe abortifacients, they would not prescribe contraceptives, they would not do in vitro fertilization. At the end of life, as we'll see going forward, they will not engage in euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, et cetera, all right? No sterilization for contraceptive purposes, all these procedures, which, by the way, typically, because they're elective procedures, they are profitable into the thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. So that means revenue loss for the system that does not engage in these unethical practices, okay? So sadly, Baptists did not want to give it up. And then Baptists proceeded instead to buy other hospitals in town, including, again, for you, those of you who may be familiar with the county, South Miami Hospital, Doctors Hospital that used to belong to the University of Miami Medical School, okay, to the University of Miami, Doctors Hospital, Homestead Hospital, Mariners Hospital down in the Keys. They've also expanded, I believe now the Palm Beach also. So anyway, Baptist Hospital has now become a system and has grown tremendously, all right? What did I want to say by that? Oh yes, so when there are these mergers that happen between systems, right? One of these mergers, this is an example, a classical example of a Catholic hospital with a non-Catholic hospital. They have to carve out and see what the merger is going to include and what the merger is going to exclude. And I'm saying all this precisely because of that part 6 of the introduction here of the table of contents. This part 6 is the collaboration between essentially Catholic healthcare organizations and non-Catholic healthcare organizations, and what may be part of the merger and what may not be part of the merger. Okay. Anyway, again, it's one of my typical digressions here that is not directly related to today's lecture, but I'm just trying to highlight this document that is very succinct, informative, compressed, and please read it at least minimally, part 4 and part 5. And even the whole document is not that long, you know, it's basically about 27, 28 pages in a narrow format, in a half-page format. Okay, let me get back to my presentation here before I totally run far afield. Yes, so we're trying to ascertain the health of the mother and the child with PD, right? So there is one directive specifically, which is directive number 50. So again, we use ERD as the acronym for the document, Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services. It's a mouthful, so we just refer to it as the ERDs. And number 50 is that directive. So I copied it here already, which says prenatal diagnosis is permitted when the procedure does not threaten the life or physical integrity of the unborn child or the mother, and does not subject them to disproportionate risks, when the diagnosis can provide information to guide preventative care for the mother or pre or postnatal care for the child, and when the parents, or at least the mother, gives free and informed consent. Prenatal diagnosis is not permitted when undertaken with the intention of aborting an unborn child with a serious defect. All right, so again, the directive, as you can see, is pretty succinct. I picked up on this in the 90s, actually, when I was doing my first doctorate in Rome, the doctorate in moral theology when I was studying in Rome. And I was doing it on bioethics, precisely the bioethics of the unborn. And essentially, the topic of my dissertation was the human fetus as a medical patient, which back then was science fiction. In the 90s, it just wasn't happening, all right? But the technology could be seen, I could see the technology advancing at such a pace that eventually that could become a reality, all right? The human fetus as a medical patient. Think about it for a moment. So that was the topic for my dissertation. And I picked up on this particular directive of this document because, first of all, of the 77 directives that are in the document, it's the only one that addresses prenatal diagnosis directly, right? But it is a technique that is standard of care for pregnant moms, right? So standard of care, prenatal diagnosis, even just palpation, like I mentioned, just a physical exam. And therefore, since this technique, this bioethical evaluation of PND or PD has a positive and a negative, right? The first paragraph is positive, is permitted, the verb, but in the second paragraph is not permitted. Okay, so the distinction between these two was essentially, the bioethical distinction between these two was essentially my dissertation, for my first doctorate on the one on moral theology. The one in genetics at Purdue was different. That was 15 years later, and that was based on the structure and function of DNA, which was totally scientific and not directly related to bioethics, okay? Now, so going back to P&D here, see, it's permitted as long as it's for healing, essentially. Doesn't threaten the life or the physical integrity of the unborn child or the mother, right? So we have to see here about the invasive techniques. And it is used as some kind of information that can be used either to benefit the unborn child or the born child, right? Postnatal care. Give you some examples just as an illustration. And of course, on the mother's side, there has to be consent, which is actually going to be the topic for next class. And by the way, since I'm just came to my mind that next class, again, I have prison ministry, so it will not be live like this, all right? I will send you, as always, the video and the PowerPoint and the outline for that lecture, next lecture, all right? For which there will be a summary because it's a new topic. We're going into end-of-life issues now. With next class, we're going to start looking at end-of-life issues. And it's going to be about consent, precisely. Informed consent, free and informed consent. Okay, all right. But that's pretty obvious, but it's a basic fundamental requirement for medical practice today. So PD is not permitted when it's going to be used for the intention of aborting the child. Simply because the child has some kind of genetic defect, right? Not even a serious defect, let alone something that is compatible with life. Like, for example, missing a limb. The unborn child could be missing a hand, a foot. I know a nun, for example, in Miami, who is a member of a religious order here, that since she's missing half her arm. She was born that way, all right? And she's extremely dexterous with one hand. She does more than you and I put together, all right? It's amazing how dexterous she is with her hand, with her single hand. And she was just born missing an arm. That's, of course, excuse me, it's a birth defect, but it's certainly compatible with life. And she's a very generous person, generous woman, has devoted her life to the Lord and to the gospel. And there you have it. But I can tell you from my research in my dissertation that the vast majority of moms who get a diagnosis like that will abort their child. Okay. So we have to stick around here for a little bit and consider just going essentially to the bottom line. First of all, I'll just give you two stats that are very similar, but pointing in opposite directions, precisely from my research a few years ago now, that approximately more than 90% of moms who have a prenatal diagnosis done on their pregnancy, more than 90% of that result comes back negative. Now, keep in mind what is negative and positive means with a diagnosis, all right? First of all, a diagnosis is specific. They're looking for something. So a diagnosis is specific to a particular illness or condition, etc. So a negative diagnosis is actually a good thing. It's something positive. meaning a negative diagnosis means that the diagnosis did not detect what they were looking for, the abnormality that they were looking for. All right. So for example, if they're looking for, I'll stick with the classic, for the karyotype. What is the classic for the karyotype? They're looking for
Down syndrome.
Exactly. Down syndrome. Okay. But it can be any number of abnormalities in the chromosomes. It could be missing any one of them, or a whole, or the entire pair, etc. But Down syndrome is the classical one. And so when they test for Down syndrome with the karyotype, and the pregnant mom gets a negative result, that's a good thing. That's a positive thing. It means that they did not detect Down syndrome. Now, it could be that the child has Fetal syndrome or some other Fragile X or some other genetic abnormality, but it was not what they were looking for, which was Down. All right. By the way, those other abnormalities may also show up in a karyotype, depending, may or may not show up. But anyway, what I'm saying is that a negative diagnosis is something good. A positive diagnosis is an alarm. It means that they have detected something, some abnormality, malformation, abnormality, etc. It could be anatomical or it could be physiological, right? And therefore, 90% of PD comes back negative. That's a good thing. It means that the pregnancy is, essentially good to go. And they'll monitor at different stages, etc. Of the 10% that comes back positive, all right? 10% of PD that comes back positive for whatever, I'm talking globally. Again, it could be something as simple as missing a fingernail, or something as critical as missing a lung, or missing a brain, anencephaly, right? Anencephaly, there are different degrees of anencephaly or microcephaly. They may actually be born alive and be alive for a number of days, weeks. Typically, they will put a cap on top. They have some kind of abnormality of the face generally, but not always, with a skull cap and dress and so forth. They may look fairly normal. Look at this microcephalous child, how long he or she has grown, all right? So it may actually be compatible with life or not. It's a very drastic thing. But I'm just saying that PD globally, of the less than 10% that comes back positive, over 90% of those mothers abort. Over 90% of those mothers abort. With a full range of anomalies, many of which are certainly compatible with life, It may not be the perfect baby, but when you start getting into that frame of mind, what are we doing? We're doing a selection, right? We're doing eugenics. We're selecting on the human race. So this is essentially the background of PD, clinically and bioethically. And therefore, to your question, Christina, why do the amnio? I mentioned typically for legal reasons, the OBGYN has to offer it because it's a technique that is available. But as the OBGYN offers that technique, also has to point out, and I hope they did, that mention is not without risk, but the risk is 0.05% that you will miscarry. But they have to state, for transparency, they have to state the risk and the indication for what? To see if there are any anomalies. But because it is, some OBGYNs consider it standard of care, it depends, all right? But if they consider it standard of care, then they offer it. It's available. Insurance does cover it. And therefore, they offer it. But that's precisely, and when they don't, that's the problem. When they don't, and the child is born with an anomaly, like for example, Down syndrome, which can certainly be detected with PD, right? The doctor can be sued for what is called as wrongful birth or wrongful life. Wrongful birth is the mother suing the doctor for withholding information that could have helped her to decide whether or not to have an abortion. Of course, keep in mind, we are looking at abortion, a procured abortion from an ethical perspective as something that is wrong. But because it is still legal to this day, right, then the doctor has to go by what is legal. And a doctor can be sued for wrongful birth, millions of dollars, because now the mom can claim that she has to maintain this anomalous child for life. Well, how long that life is going to be? So it gets serious. There's another type of suit that is called wrongful life. That is the actual unborn. Well, once the unborn is born with an anomaly, right? That child can now sue the doctor for wrongful life. Wrongful life legally means that that child was not allowed to be killed in the womb when it was legal. And so now that child has to live this anomalous life for the rest of her or his life. So, and because the child, if it's a psychological anomaly, may not have the capacity to sue, and certainly if the child is a minor and does not have the capacity to sue, someone will sue on their behalf. And there are groups, there are advocacy groups that will sue the doctor on behalf of the child with an anomaly. Because the child is a minor. Of course, the mother has to consent, right? But there's money involved, there's millions of dollars involved, so there's an incentive. So now you see why the doctor offered the PD. Okay.
Yes,
Some doctors consider it standard of care. It's legal, it's covered by insurance. And if they don't offer it, it may be suable, it may be exposure for them, legal exposure. That's the state of affairs.
Father Cho,
Yep.
I have another question.
Yes.
It's a little bit more general, but with the document that you gave us to read, the
ERD.
yes. So I understand that is mainly for, and I know that we lay people should read it as well, but my question is the pastoral vision of the church in regards to lay people like me, right?
Yes.
Like the ones that are taking the masters with you right now.
Yep.
I mean, there's priests and they're doctors, but I'm talking about someone like me. What is the pastoral view of the church into what I'm learning? What do the church expect from someone like me? Because doctors, I understand, and I clearly see they have to deal with this every day.
Right.
And they're Catholic, so they wanted to do the best.
Right.
The priests are doing the same.
Yeah.
But in someone like me, what is the expectation?
Sure. Well, okay, so it has two benefits. One is at a personal level, and by extension, your family also, because this clarifies a lot of issues, not only at the beginning of life, but also at the end of life. And you'll see that the issues at the end of life are more complicated from one perspective, is that simply instead of dealing with one cell or a few cells, as we do with the beginning of life, we're dealing with trillions of cells at the end of life, and then they don't all die at the same time, okay? So the end of life issues are going to be somewhat more complicated from that perspective. But this ERDs gives a lot of guidance. Even non-Catholics, one does not have to be Catholic to follow these teachings, because they're just basically pro-life, pro-human. They hold up the respect of the dignity of the human person at all levels, etc. But also, if you're involved in ministry, in pastoral ministry, for example, visiting a hospital or even caring for other people, family or friends. This document can also be a good guide, all right? You can also integrate it in your particular case, since you're the catechist at a Catholic school, you can integrate aspects of this ERDs into your teaching there, especially with regards to the parents. It would be sweet if we can get this document into the hands of every Catholic parent in the school, for example. So this is something that you can take up with the principal and or the pastor, because this is a way of getting this document, which is very succinct, very simple, free, etc., into the hands of our people out there. Mm-hmm. Okay, question answered?
Yes, thank
Moving
you.
forward. Back to my PD. Okay. Well, so we have these two other topics to cover, but I see it's already 11:20. So how about we take a 10-minute break, 7-minute break? Okay. I'm going to restart at 11:30. All right. I think this is a nice little time to pause here. So I'm going to restart at 11:30, unless there are any pressing questions or comments. I hear none, and therefore, here goes pause. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue, hopefully, just 1 more hour, wrap it up by 12:30, okay? So hopefully you can hear me and see the screen. Can anyone confirm that, please?
Yes, we can
Okay.
see it.
Thank you very much. All right, going forward. So we have 2 more topics, hopefully not as long as this first one, which is human-animal chimeras, and finally, maternal fetal medicine and surgery. So we're going to look at human-animal chimeras. First of all, a chimera comes from the Greek mythology, which is 2 or more animals put together, right, to form some kind of a mythological creature. Obviously, these things don't exist in life, but they have been, they come from the Greek mythology, which then passed into the Western world through the Roman Empire, etc. But believe it or not, now it can be a reality in the lab. And so again, what used to be science fiction is becoming a reality, and therefore we have to address the bioethics of it. It turns out that in 2016, the NIH, so you're familiar with NIH, is the National Institutes of Health. NIH and NSF are the 2 agencies, federal agencies in the United States that fund research. NIH for human research and NSF for non-human research. And back then I looked at the annual budget of NIH for 2016 was something like $13 billion for that year, okay? That's 13 and 9 zeros next to it. That was the annual budget back then. So very significant amount of money, of our tax money, is being poured into human and non-human research today in the United States and the rest of the world, obviously, but we're talking about here, the US, with all the technology that we have. So this is what was proposed: to lift a moratorium on human-animal chimeras. Of course, research on that, right? Not to take it to full term, but to do the research, what is known as proof of principle. In other words, proof of principle is if it can be done, if it actually works. So there's present a moratorium on the federal level. This doesn't say about state or private funding, okay? This is federal because it's NIH or NSF, like I say, for non-human, but this is human, so it falls under NIH. There is presently a moratorium on doing human-animal chimeras. In other words, of mixing human and animal cells to generate a new creature, a new entity, a new biological entity, right? Using federal funds for that. There's a moratorium, which is a good thing. There's a ban, a prohibition. Now, obviously, they're not going to be mixing adult cells of human and non-human, right? Because that's not going to go anywhere. They're talking about embryos, human and non-human embryos being mixed together to form a new entity, which is kind of a hybrid of the two, but it's actually a chimera because the animal cells continue to be animal cells and the human cells continue to be human cells in this new biological entity that is a composite. All right, so specifically, see, early embryos, they wanted to work on two aspects. Oops, a little head. The two aspects are this. One was the human brain, and the other one was the human reproductive tract, specifically human female reproductive tract, and even more specifically, human ovaries, for different reasons. The human brain, because, so it goes back to the 1990s again, when there was a project started of the Human Genome Project. You know, if you remember, the Human Genome Project was to map the human DNA, all the base pairs of the 3 billion base pairs of the human DNA, what is known as the genome, the human genome, to map it out sequentially so that research can be done. This is part of what is known as dry bench research. In other words, mining is a big data analytics, essentially. The whole genome, the human genome, the 3 billion base pairs in the particular sequence that they exist, right? With some variations, of course, from individual to individual, but a lot of research is being done. And that was a big project. It was an international project that started in the 90s. And the goal was to finish it by 2000. And I remember it because that's when I was doing I started my second PhD in genetics precisely in 2001. And the mapping, the overall mapping had already ended to an accuracy of, first of all, it was a little delayed for 1 year. So we're actually talking 2001. And finally it was published in Nature and online, right, for free, to 99.99%, I think it was, 99.99% accuracy. But when you do the math on 3 billion base pairs, the 0.001% that is missing is significant. It's several thousand. I'm not going to do it on top of my head, but it's several thousand, maybe hundreds of thousands of DNA sequence that is missing. All right, that 0.001%. And so they needed to fine tune it and finish that, do that last push. And I can tell you also, it was mostly in the centrosome region, the centromere region, the central part, which is a lot of repeats. Like you have thousands of thymines, you know, adenine or thymine or guanine, any one of the 4 bases, just repeated thousands of times. So the sequencers that were available at that time, the DNA sequencers, these huge machines, were not able to be that accurate, all right? They couldn't read thousands of single letters at a time. They needed some kind of disruption in the pattern in order to anchor the read. Now sequencers have become more sophisticated and they actually plowed through the centromere of the various chromosomes, chromatin actually, and therefore now we have essentially the 100% of the DNA genome sequenced, deciphered, published online for free. You can go online and read it yourself if you want and do research on it. and many other species now, an increasing number of species, I should say, plants, animals, bacteria are being sequenced, fungi, and added to the collection, to the library, the genomic library of the world. All right, so where was I? Oh yes, that project, essentially the Human Genome Project, right? The Human Genome Project finished in 2001 when they did the fine sequencing, and two significant, well, James Watson, for example, was involved in it. In fact, I think they used, he was one of the 100 samples that were used to represent the whole human. Imagine, back then maybe we were maybe around 6.57 billion people. And it's now come to be known that that project was based on 100 samples, just because 100 is a easy number in statistics to use as a sample, but it's certainly very, very underrepresented, right, for the whole 7 billion people. At any rate, the genome is fairly consistent that I can get accuracy with that. Another one that I know was sequenced, it has come to be known then, names that are significant today. Craig Venter, who was also involved. In fact, he separated halfway through the project, but he was involved early on in the sequencing. And the one who finally carried it to term actually was Francis Collins. Dr. Collins, who to this day is the director of NIH, okay? And so these are significant names in the Human Genome Project. Anyway, once that finished, it's like scientists needed another project to do at the global level, international. And so now we have the Human Brain Project. I don't know if you've heard about that one, but the Human Brain Project is one of these also decades-long projects that labs throughout the world have taken on, wet bench, dry bench, etc., is to try to find out everything possible about the human brain. From the gross anatomy and physiology of the brain down to the molecular level, all right? And every phase in between. And of course, there is included AI, artificial intelligence, right? Just, I mean, not a week goes by, I say not a week goes by without a bioethical issue coming up. Just a couple of days ago, I read in the BBC that they are detecting now that these supercomputers and artificial intelligence certainly can be trained to think and so forth. They may actually be expressing feelings or emotions or sentiments, So the supercomputer or the artificial intelligence may feel happy or sad or empathize with human feelings. Kind of scary. They're taking on personality of their own. That's the level of sophistication. Anyway, back to the human-animal chimeras. In 2016, as you can see, not too long ago, right? It coincided with one of the presidential elections, actually. In August, NIH was proposing to lift the moratorium on human-animal chimeras, as it says here. Oh, yes. And so specifically on two organs, on brain, human brain, and on human, this is the human brain here, the neurological contribution, and the human ovaries. Bottom line, to grow a substantially human brain and a substantially human ovary in an animal model. They're called models that we use in the lab for research. I mean, the typical model that gets it is the mouse, right? But these were pigs, specifically pigs, because a number of anatomical and physiological conditions about the pig that is similar to the human. For example, the human pig, the human heart, the pig heart is very similar to the human heart. And again, you may have read, I think it was last month, that there was a pig heart transplanted into a human experimentally a month or two ago. I will cover that topic later when we look at organ transplants, okay? That's no longer beginning of life, that's more end of life when we look at organ transplantation. Anyway, back to the human brain and the human ovary in a pig, grown in a pig. The whole issue for this, clinically, right, NIH, humans, is to be able to supposedly experiment on that human brain in a pig because it was not a human being. It's a pig being, right? And so certainly we don't need consent from the pig to experiment on the pig. But it happened that that pig would have had a human brain had this thing go through. So this one on the human brain in a pig was for the Human Brain Project that is going on right now throughout the world, to be able to do certain experiments that we are not able to do on human beings because of lack of consent, right? Because no one will consent to do experimentation, and it's unethical to do certain experiments on human brains. We can think of the Nazi era and the Third Reich in the 1930s and 1940s Germany, with the concentration camps and the inhumane experimentation that was done there on human beings. Right. Now, how about the ovaries? Again, because sperm is cheap, easy to obtain sperm, millions and millions of them, but eggs are expensive in every way, in every sense of the word, all right, as we saw for in vitro, beginning with the hyperovulation, et cetera, you know, to obtain human eggs is expensive, no matter how you cut it. And so to have human ovaries in a pig generating human eggs galore, you know, for experimentation, then that could be potentially a good thing for human research, you see? A source, essentially, practically an unlimited source of human eggs without having to bother women and to risk their health and their life, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see the motivation behind it, you know, and the end in itself, the ends are good. Lofty ends, if you will, because it's all about the advancement of medicine, right? But the means, we have to go back to the means, you know, is it ethical to grow these particular organs in a non-human? So before we tackle that, let's just look at the technique for a moment to be clear. Essentially, it involves, well, it's a technique that was invented by Yamanaka, a Japanese researcher, pluripotent stem cells, iPSCs, induced pluripotent stem cells, right? S is the plural. So iPSC, induced pluripotent stem cells. Stem cells that are embryonic stem cells. In other words, in this case, the embryo is the pig embryo. And the idea is to insert into the ICM, remember the ICM is the inner cell mass of the pig embryo. Hope you can see that diagram, right? Human cells. And see if and where those human cells grow in the pig embryo. So let's review a little more detail. Here is a blastocyst. It's a big blastocyst, pig. The ICM, the inner cell mass, remember what the inner cell mass becomes? Eventually the inner cell mass becomes the embryo proper, whereas the trophoblast becomes the placenta, right? Pig. All right. Now we obtain human cells. We can obtain adult stem cells. We all have stem cells in our body. And we'll talk more about stem cells when we talk about, stem cells and cloning. There's going to be a lecture on that later on. But for now, just we know that we have stem cells, not only embryonic stem cells that are actually the inner cell mass, those are the embryonic stem cells, but we also have what is known as adult stem cells in our body, different parts of our body. For example, in the adipose tissue, the fat, right? So the next time you have a liposuction, you can save the fat because there are stem cells in there. We have stem cells in bone marrow. Bone marrow regenerates itself. The liver, you can cut out almost a third of the liver and it will regenerate itself. If I cut my skin, that skin will grow from the inside out. That new skin that grows is precisely from stem cells. We even have stem cells in our circulatory system, in the pulp of baby teeth, hair follicles, you name it. We're discovering an increasing number of sources of stem cells in the human body, okay, of the born. And certainly doesn't kill anyone to obtain those stem cells. All we need is consent from the donor. So we take adult stem cells and through a technique known as induced pluripotent stem cells, invented by this fellow Yamanaka precisely at the beginning of the century, we can have those stem cells which are differentiated revert, go back into embryonic-like stem cells. Embryonic-like. They're not actual embryos because they're just cells, all right? And we don't go back to the level of the morula or the zygote, which are totipotent cells. We just take them back to the level of the blastocyst. And then those individual cells can be inserted, yes, through a glass cannula, like of the glass cannula that I talked about earlier, into the ICM, the inner cell mass of a pig embryo. These are the human cells that will integrate into the ICM of the pig. And then implant that chimera into the sow, the female pig, all right? So obviously this involves IVF, but on the pig, it's pig IVF. Then we implant that chimera into the female pig in the hope that it will take, right? That would actually implant. So what I want to do here is move back a little bit, move down. Here is the actual technique. This photograph should be familiar to you now. This is a micrograph of a pig. In this case, it's a pig blastocyst. Remember the suction device here. Here's the ICM, what is going to become the pig proper, the pig embryo. Here's the glass cannula with the cells, the human cells. This is the target site, already has been punctured, right? So the cannula will be inserted here and the human cells released in the hope that at least some of the cells will integrate into the pig ICM. In fact, some did and it worked. And of course, these human cells are tagged with some kind of an isotope to be traced, all right? So they're tagged. The cells are tagged with some isotope so that they can be traced. Here is the pig embryo. This is the pig embryo. That's the pig heart right there. And you can see the three sides, the three white markers here where the cells integrated. One cluster integrated in the abdominal region, and then two clusters in the front paws of the pig, the front right paw. There it is. These are, again, photographs. Now, of course, oops, these were not taken to term. This pig was not taken to term. They were euthanized as soon as they can get this evidence, because this is just, again, proof of principle. It can be done, all right? But the key question is, should it be done? Should it be done? So one thing is to put, let's say that these are skin cells, human skin cells. One thing is to put human skin cells and grow human skin on a pig skin, all right? And another thing is to grow a human brain in a pig or human ovaries in a pig, right? Again, because of the significance of those organs. So I hope, I mean, at some point in bioethics, there's a certain intuition that we have to appeal to. I hope I don't have to make a case too strongly against growing a human brain in a pig, right? There's actually a movie about that way back. It was called The Island of Dr. Moreau, something like that. And then there was a remake of it called The Island, just the island, of all this genetic manipulation, the eugenics that is going on, right? Science fiction, but like you can see, it's becoming a reality. So you can watch those if you want. The Island of Dr. Moreau is the original version, and then the remake of it is The Island updated with more sophisticated technology. But basically, in The Island of Dr. Moreau, you had these creatures who, it's an island, right? And there's a typical mad scientist doing these experiments, and the experiments went crazy. And so you have these creatures running around in the island, and they're chimeras. They're half human and half animal. Mm-hmm. And again, a science fiction movie that here now is becoming a reality. So I hope you have a common sense intuition that there's no justification ever for growing a human brain inside an animal. Because then when that animal is born with a human brain, that human brain is going to say, what am I doing in this body? Right? And then you can take it from there. So thanks be to God that the alert went out, the alarm went out, and we mounted actually a huge email campaign, because this notice was sent to selected people, selected groups in society, because NIH, being a public domain, right? It uses federal funds, our tax money, has to be transparent and has to solicit feedback from the population at large, whether they should do this or not, okay? And so someone picked up on this. It was in their radar, and they sent out an email, and it was blasted out to many pro-life groups, actually, whether they're Catholic or not. I mean, some people are pro-life just because of the dignity of the born and the unborn. Anyway, we started mounting a huge campaign of emails to get this out and just use simple language to explain what they were trying to do with this moratorium, with lifting this moratorium. And there was a page of feedback in the NIH. You'd actually had to go to the NIH site and fill out that little form that they had. This is just part of it, actually. I didn't have the whole thing. But there was a form that one filled out if one was in agreement or disagreement, and some kind of reasons in lay terms, why yes or why no, right? We should use tax money for this kind of research. Well, the response was so overwhelmingly no, that we should not go there, that then the NIH backed off and rescinded the desire or the move to lift the moratorium. So as far as I know, to this day, the moratorium is still on. Moratorium meaning that there's a ban, there's a prohibition of using federal funds for generating human-animal chimeras. All right. Now, this says nothing about state funds, and this says nothing about private funds, which are still happening. And that's why you can then think, and you can ask the question, well, how come this happened? Because these are actual micrographs, right? How come this happened? If there's a prohibition, well, there's a prohibition on federal money. But guess what? There's no prohibition on state money, and there's no prohibition on private funds. So California, the state of California, which has an institute of stem cell research, which was founded actually back in the 80s, it's been on for about 40 years now, decided to go ahead and fund it with their state money. Let me see. CIRM. CIRM. Okay, this is the California Institute for Stem Cell Research. And you can read more about it. Anyway, they donated funds, and through Salk, there's a lab, Salk Institute, very prestigious in California. They went ahead and did the research, okay? And it was a two-part research. The first part was generating the chimera. And the second part was implanting the chimera. So generating the chimera, as is explained in the diagram, is the first part here, is doing this, which was done at the Salk in California. And then, excuse me, these are pig chimeras, right? These are pig embryos with human cells in them. So because it has human cells, it is forbidden to implant these embryos into pigs in the United States because of the human thing. It's considered human trafficking somehow. And just in case, they didn't want to risk it. So they sent these chimeras, these blastocysts, to Spain. And Spain, you may know that Spain is very famous for its ham, okay? And Spain has thousands of farms with thousands of pigs in each farm. And so there's some farm in Spain that was doing the second part, the implanting. And I think they use about 2,000 pigs or something like that. Anyway, you can read the article, close the detail, but basically these blastocysts were cryopreserved, just like we saw earlier with in vitro, and were sent to Spain. And this pig farm in Spain then did the second half of the second phase, which is the attempted implantation. Of course, you can intuit that on average, 1 out of 3 or 4 actually implant and so forth. But eventually, they did manage to grow, gestate a pig, at least to this stage, where they could photograph the human cells glowing in there. And so that's how the research was actually done, which means that federal funds are one thing, but state and private funds are something else. And so we need to look at the state level of bioethics, right? And engage that legislation. But that, of course, amplifies it by 50, by a factor of 50, because we have one federal agency, but we have 50 state agencies that are involved in human and non-human research to different degrees. But the budget is still, the budget may not be in the billions of dollars, but the budget is probably in the millions of dollars, right? Certainly in the more technological states here in the US. So things that are on the radar for bioethics today in this century. Moving forward then, one last topic, which is maternal fetal medicine. Is known as maternal fetal medicine, all right? And or surgery, medicine in general, which may or may not involve surgery. Again, like I said, this topic was science fiction back in the 90s, but today is a reality. And the idea is essentially to look at the fetus as a medical patient, and also to do so this is more on the clinical side, and then they do the cost-benefit analysis on the bioethical side, if we should or should not do that intervention that is becoming available. Certainly, this type of intervention typically is still experimental medicine. It's not standard protocol, okay? It's not standard of care, but little by little it's moving in that direction. So you know that in principle, any protocol in medicine is per experimental and then eventually becomes standard of care. And here's an example. Oh, I had this too big. Give me a minute while I fill with my screen here. Okay. The other way. All these little signs are interfering with my controls. Right. So you see, there is even a journal of fetal medicine now. In other words, the field is an emerging field that is progressing. It's now peer review. It's a Springer publication, and therefore it's an emerging field of medicine is to see the human fetus as a medical patient. Interesting, exciting. Here's a conference that was 2017. This is a year after I started teaching this program. Actually, this program is now 6 years old. I started in 2016. I launched a master's in bioethics here at St. Thomas University. And so just 1 year later, there was this conference going on. And Adelaide, that sounds like Australia. Already presenting cutting edge research on maternal fetal medicine. Now, sticking with the clinical a little bit more, just to see what's available. Let me try put this fellow upstairs. And this one on the side, there, okay. Yes. You can see that quite a few interventions can be done. Some of it is, okay, so when we talk about maternal fetal medicine, not everything is surgery, okay? It could be something as simple as administering medication to the mother for the fetus that will go through the placenta into the fetus, okay? Or it could be something as complicated as actual surgery. And any range in between, any intervention in between. You can see that technology is involved. It's typically sophisticated technology. The first thing about the technology is that typically they're miniature instruments. For example, there are stents and balloons that can be inserted into the fetal lungs or other parts of the circulatory system for unclogging, opening airways, etc. All right, that's one type of intervention. Or there can be, for spina bifida, for example, there can be some interventions done on spina bifida, which is the bulging of the, see if that's active, of the spinal cord through the spinal column, all right? Or a meningocele, actually this is a meningocele in the lumbar region. There are a number of things that can be, there's shunts that can be put on the brain to drain hydrocephaly, for example. When the brain starts filling, not the brain, but the cranium starts filling up with fluid, and it's going to impinge on the normal growth of the brain, all right? So shunts can be put to drain that fluid, as in hydrocephaly. So that's another one. Another one, when we have discordant twins or twins that are sharing. Give me a minute. Now this is in the background. To get up here. Bring forward. Where is it? Picture format. Give me a minute. I just have to bring it forward. All the way. Big to front. There. Okay. Yes, when you have twins, they may be, let me see. So these are going to be some kind of identical twins that are sharing a placenta, right? But they have their own umbilical cord and they're discordant. They're different sizes. They can cauterize the capillaries here that are fusing the two placentas so that each twin will have his or her own placenta. And then let them develop and see what happens. One of them may be viable and the other one may not, but there's no direct intervention on the fetus as such. The intervention is here. Now the placenta is a vital organ, it's temporary but vital. It's the only temporary vital organ that I can think of in the human. It's discarded at birth, but during the pregnancy, during gestation, it is certainly vital, right, for the fetus. So any intervention on the placenta has to be justified. It has to be life for life. In other words, the intervention has to be serious enough and promising enough with a good assurance that it will, there's a likelihood of saving the life, at least of one of the two fetuses. And so you see, it's the technique is life for life, and therefore it may be justified bioethically. All right, and that's where we get into what we call the cost-benefit analysis. The cost is not just monetary, because obviously these techniques are sophisticated, therefore, and they're running to the thousands or maybe dozens of thousands of dollars. And because they're experimental, many times insurance will not cover it. All right, so that is a real cost monetarily, but also cost in the benefit, in the sense of what is the risk. So cost benefit, or we can see risk benefit. I should put here cost, risk, benefit, right? Do they outweigh, do the benefits outweigh the risk? And that has to do specifically with the fourth criterion of the principle of double effect. Remember, the fourth criterion is proportionality. Now we're talking about life for life here, right? Or not? Is the intervention too risky to justify, or is the intervention, what kind of assurance, in other words, what kind of assurance does it give to be able to justify it? Just to wrap it up, I'm gonna talk about some of the more dramatic things that are being done. As you can see, these are actual photographs. Here is a womb that has been opened surgically, and the surgeon is doing surgery. It looks like a meningocoele here in the back, right? Like this one of the fetus. You see, this is the back side of the fetus here, right? The rump. And you can see that he or she is growing typically neurological tissue, the spinal cord that protrudes out through the spinal cord. And they can do some surgery on that. And then sew up the womb again, and the fetus will continue his or her gestation. The most dramatic that I've heard of to date is that they actually disconnect. They clamp the fallopian tubes and the uterus, and they cut and disconnect the uterus, from the vagina and the fallopian tubes. So you got basically three tubes coming into the uterus, right? You got the two fallopian tubes and you got the vagina. So they clamp and cut the two fallopian tubes and the vagina temporarily. They excise the uterus, open, do the surgery, put the uterus back in place, do the surgery, close up again the womb, the uterus, and then reconnect the uterus back to the fallopian tubes and to the vagina. Actually, those three tubes are smooth muscle, essentially, and may anastomose. Anastomosis is a lot of sewing, very tiny little sewing that is done around, all right? Think of, it would be functionally something similar to reconnecting tubes that have been tied tubes for a woman who tied her tubes for sterilization, okay, for non-therapeutic sterilization. Imagine that, amazing, but real because this is an actual photograph. Now, this has another level of thing that this photograph, photographs like this have become viral over time because this was, to my knowledge, the first surgery that was done this way. You can see the womb here and the incision, and this is the fetal hand. This happened at the end of the surgery. This little fetus reached out with his or her hand and grabbed the finger of the surgeon, just grabbed onto it, you know? And of course, people interpret this in all kinds of ways. Some people are saying that the little fetus is giving a high five to the surgeon. Thank you for the surgery. Others say, grabbing and saying, why are you doing this to me? You know? And others just say, well, because the fetus is used to grabbing. For example, the fetus will grab the umbilical cord and will play with it simply because it's in front of it. I'm sorry, in front of him or her, all right? So interpret it whichever way you can, but this is an actual photograph. And it happened. So since then, now it has become kind of fashionable for fetal surgeons to just probe and to entice the fetal hand to grab, all right? And then they'll say to the assistant, take the photo, take the shot. All right, so now it's become kind of fashionable for these fetal surgeons to get their photos taken like this, okay?
For the trophy.
The photo opportunity, the photo op. Yes,
Father,
yes.
are they able to use anesthesia in surgery like that for the fetus?
Okay, the short answer is I don't know, all right? But it's a very interesting question. It's definitely a clinical question. And I assume that at least local anesthesia, right? If not general, but you imagine now you just opened up a whole horizon for me, fetal monitoring. Something that I'm thinking as I'm speaking is that the vitals of the mother are certainly being monitored, right? But she's not really the patient, it's her unborn. So the fetal vitals are gonna be monitored, and that can be done to some degree, at least heartbeat and so forth. And so if there's fetal monitoring, then perhaps some degree of anesthesia is indicated, right? Depending on the severity of the intervention.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so you can see it's an exciting field, isn't it? And I always like to end with this because if we consider that the fetus is now a medical patient, oh yes, so I said that from some perspectives, the fetus is the ideal patient. For example, the hospital stay. There's really no hospital stay. The hospital is the womb, right? The hospital room is the womb. So just think of the support system. The support system of a hospital to maintain a room. This is equivalent to the intensive care unit, right, of a hospital. That's the room that is most expensive. Like administering an aspirin in an intensive care room, I'm just going to throw it out there, may cost $20 or $30, simply because of the infrastructure that is needed to dispense that aspirin in an ICU, all right? Not to think of all the sophisticated equipment and the life support that is needed for those rooms. So the womb is the ICU of the fetal patient, and it's for free. right? The mother is taking care of all the expenses. And also the fetus is so young and tender that she or he is able to heal much better because their cells, their tissues are pristine. They have a lot of, they literally have fetal stem cells, right, to heal. So a cut will heal much easier than for us. Also, because this is an antiseptic environment, there's no bacteria, there's no risk of infection. Well, there is risk of infection during the surgery itself, but once that that procedure is done and this area seals, right, again from the inside out, the fetus is in an antiseptic environment. There's no risk of the superbugs in a hospital with this kind of surgery, right? And or recovery. I'm thinking more of the recovery. So there are many, many reasons why a fetus is really the ideal patient. And I'll just leave it at that. You can think of these possibilities, but the overarching big question, the biggest question that I ask really at the end of this lecture, which kind of summarizes the end of all the, one way or another, the topics that we have covered, the bioethical topics at the beginning of human life. If the human fetus can be a medical patient, how can she or he not be a person, not be a human being? You know, we practice medicine on human beings. Even if you want to look at it as veterinary, it's not veterinary that we're practicing because this is a human being. It's not a non-human animal. So it's medicine. And how can a human, how can a fetal patient not be a human being, right? It's impossible not to be a human being. By definition, a patient is a human being. And then if the fetus is a patient or a human being, then you go backwards chronologically, you know, at what point do we put off the cutoff of between human and not human or semi-human or partially human, right? Any moment between going back chronologically during the 9 months, between the fetus and all the way back to the zygote, any stage there is arbitrary because it's a progressive growth. There's a progressive growth and differentiation of tissues and cells. So if we leave the zygote where he or she is supposed to be in place and allow him or her to develop forward through the 9 months, it's a whole gradual process. There's no substantial leap that happens from the zygote to the birthing of the baby, where we can say at this point, before this point, this entity was non-human or was partially human. See, it's all gradual progression. And to me, this whole issue of fetal medicine makes it very obvious. Anyway, in my mind, it makes it very, very obvious. So I'll leave you with that. So still a few minutes before 12:30. If anyone has any other comments or questions, have any of you heard about maternal fetal medicine, for example?
I wanted to share with you that when Catalina, my daughter,
yes,
she had COVID and she was pregnant. She got COVID in her.
Oh, now as an adult, pregnant.
Yeah, yes, no, this is her third child, the one that was just born.
Oh, I see. Okay, give me a minute because since I'm on my laptop, I don't know if everyone else is hearing the question. Let me ask, are other people hearing the question or the comment that is being made?
Yes.
Okay, all right. I think that was you, Paula. Okay, so you can hear it okay?
Yes, at least I can hear it okay.
All right, well, if one person can hear it, then I assume everyone else can hear it. So go ahead, Christina. I can hear it faintly because I'm just hearing it through my own speaker of the laptop. Go ahead. So your daughter who was pregnant during COVID?
Yes, she was 30 weeks
Wow.
pregnant in
Mhm,
January
mhm.
when she got COVID.
Wow.
And she had COVID and her two children and her husband did. And she ended in the hospital. And one thing that happens to Catalina, she did not have lower oxygen, but her ambiotic, yes,
Amniotic fluid. Mhm.
it broke because of the coughing.
Oh, okay. So she broke the font, rompió la fuente.
But no completed. And the baby was 30 weeks.
Wow.
And so for us,
Mhm.
it was a whole new dimension.
Yes.
So they keep her in the hospital and they did not treat her first.
Mhm.
They treat the baby first.
Wow.
That was the main goal, to make
Mhm.
sure that his lungs were strong enough to continue in the pregnancy.
Wow. Okay. Hold on a second. As you go along, I just want to make a couple of comments because, all right, so the amniotic fluid obviously is necessary for maintaining the baby alive in there, right? But the baby can afford losing some of that fluid. The coughing was so strong that it actually dislodged the plug and she started leaking amniotic fluid. Mhm. Now, what you're describing is known as triage, especially for those of you who are looking into going into medical school or nursing, whatever. Triage is when you have to decide, typically in the emergency room or under emergency. It was invented actually by the doctors in the field during the Napoleonic Wars, to decide which soldiers to treat, which injured soldiers to treat. And they came up with this idea because they have to do it very quickly. Minutes could be the difference between life and death, treating a wounded soldier, depending on the severity of the wound. So they basically, when they went into the field, it was like right after a battle or even during the battle, their injuries, their soldiers injured, they divided the soldiers into 3 groups, all right? And one group was healthy enough that they could survive without an intervention, without medical intervention. They may not be fully healthy, but they're healthy enough to survive without immediate medical intervention. The other group was too far gone into the injury to be saved realistically with the medical resources available, limited resources. You can think in a hospital, in a war zone, okay? So the other group was too far gone into their injuries, typically bleeding to death or something like that, still alive, but with the resources, limited resources that they have, it was determined just by first sight that they could not be saved, or too many of the resources would be used to save just 1 or 2 of these. And so they were put in another group. And the middle group is the ones that are injured and realistically with the supplies and the personnel that the doctors had that could save some of those lives, all right? That was the middle group, and that's the one that they concentrated on. And the other groups were left to live or die. Drastic. That's called triage, and it's from the French, making 3. It's a reference to three groups. So basically, they did triage on your daughter, and they focused on your granddaughter. I don't know if it's a grandson. Okay, so he got the priority.
Yes, so they treat him first, but of course she had COVID.
Yeah.
So she was isolated. They treat him first for his lungs. And what was really for me new, I mean, all that they decided that the baby can stay in her womb at least for 4 more weeks. That was the goal.
Yep.
And so I learned about this new doctor, which is now the neonatologist, is the one that takes care of the fetus. Exactly. I don't know how it's a very weird name. And he's the one that was taking care of Catalina. So when she got out of COVID, then they treat her for her lungs.
Right.
And they waited until he was 4 weeks. So by 34 weeks, they decided to induce, and the her doctor said, I would like to at least 1 more week. And the one that takes care of the fetus said, nope, it has to be today. And
Wow.
and it was very scary because it was something so new for us. But thank goodness the baby was born okay. He was in 2 more weeks in intensive care, in the
NICU,
right,
neonatal intensive care unit.
exactly. And so it's just new for me, totally new. So you said, and they saved the baby. And one more thing that I wanted to share that happened.
Okay, before going forward then, because I just curious really, but I want to know a little bit of the clinical aspect. So when they decided to treat her unborn before her, they triage right there. It means that he was more critical than her. And yet the lungs are non-functional in the unborn, right? He's not breathing. But so why was it that they treated him? He got COVID?
I don't know exactly, Father, but they said that they needed to strengthen their lungs. I think it's because of the time of the week that she was.
I see.
That's when the lungs developed, I think. I don't know.
All right. So it's a critical time for the lung development, 30 weeks. Because I also want to mention that as far as I know, so this has to do with viability, right? In fact, he could have been, with a C-section, he could have been excised and put in NICU. The viability now is a moving target, but it's as early as 21 weeks, I think, or 23 weeks. So 23 weeks is the earliest that I've heard of that an unborn can be saved that has survived. And in fact, it was at the Baptist system precisely here in Miami a few years ago. It was a 23-week-old fetus who survived. And so that establishes what is known as viability. Again, that is a moving target into a younger and younger age because of the level of sophistication of the NICU, of the neonatal intensive care unit. Essentially, these units are becoming almost artificial wombs. So sophisticated. But anyway, so at 30 is when this event happened, and they went into 34.
Correct. And they induced her, but in the meantime, one miracle.
She delivered naturally.
Well, no, it didn't happen. She did both before naturally, and they tried, but the baby was not ready because he was not in position.
Okay.
So they have to do a C-section at the end. But one thing I wanted to share, that it was a miracle. When he positioned, because he moves around a lot.
Yeah.
He covers the hole, so the amniotic fluid increases.
Okay.
It was incredible. So
in other words, he used his head to plug the hole.
Correct.
Is that a smart kid or what? I'm running out of fluid here. Better do something. What do I have? My hand is too little. How about my head? Boom.
That's correct. He did that, and
hey, Mom, you like this position?
And the doctors were amazed. They call it a miracle. And it happened during the 4 weeks. He moved a little bit, and at the end, he wasn't with his head down the day that they induced. So what they decided to do, this is another thing that I learned, because they have to induce, this doctor said, no, we cannot wait another week. They tried to move the baby from outside. And my son-in-law says that it's a very painful procedure. They were trying to put it in position, but from outside, never touching the baby inside.
Right, outside, yeah. I think it's called tologosis. Let me check it out. There's a name for it. It's a whole science of haptology or tologony, to try to move the baby, the unborn, by manipulating the mother's abdomen.
Right. And as they were attempting to do it, the placenta broke. So that's when the doctor said, that's it. And they did emergency C-section.
Wow. Mhm.
But anyway, it was interesting because it goes,
Amazing.
yeah,
So actually, they were trying to manipulate him into position.
correct.
Mm. I can't remember the exact term right now, but there is a term anyway. Okay, I don't want to delay, so you folks can look it up. But there is a science and an art of moving the unborn around gently by manipulating the mother's abdomen, especially
I
when,
think it's called external cephalic version.
sorry,
External cephalic version.
yes,
I believe that's what it's called.
okay.
I might be wrong. I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
All right. There you go. All right. For breech position. Yeah, I guess it takes two people. One has to pull, the other one has to push or something like that. Excellent. Yeah. Fantastic. So
It was a very interesting beginning of the year, Father, believe me.
yes, indeed, to say the least. So, well, you know, I say we go from miracle to miracle. It's a miracle that we're conceived, and it's a miracle we're born, and it's a miracle we're still alive anyway. So we just go from miracle to miracle here. Okay, folks, really, that's all I have. Thank you once again for your participation. Any parting questions or comments from anyone? Okay, I hear none. So I'm going to close it down. Thanks again. Remember, next Saturday we'll not meet live, but I will send you during the week the stuff for you to work on, but you don't have a summary due for this lecture. Okay, so I'll try to send it early this week so you can use your time for developing the other one, the next one coming up. Once
Okay,
again,
thank you. Have a
thank
great
you.
day.
Okay, you too. All
Thank
the
you,
best.
Father. Thank you. And great pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
All the best.